So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to Dominic, and he's going to discuss the textbook chapter 5.
Yes, hello everyone. Nice to see you all. So this chapter was all about the different regime types that exist. Of course, we are all very familiar with democracies and autocracies, but I think there's a lot of people here who maybe didn't get so much exposure to comparative politics in the past. If you know me, I am a huge comparative politics nerd. I did not start out this way. I did not discover my love for comparative politics until junior year of college. I didn't want to take the class. I thought it sounded horrifically boring, but I had to, and I proceeded to fall in love with it. And from there, I think I quite literally took maybe 6 or 7 upper division comparative politics classes. So this is my bread and butter here. Next slide, please. All right, so democracy versus autocracy. I think we all understand this pretty well. Democracy being Greek for rule of the people. Of course, here I actually have the definition for representative democracy. Technically, there is another type of democracy. It's called direct democracy, where instead of electing representatives, you have citizens who vote directly on the laws. Pretty much 99% of all democracies around the world practice representative democracy because, it's kind of the much better way to do things. I think the idea is that by electing representatives, you're kind of selecting maybe for people who have expertise, who can make decisions. There are some places, I think, in Scandinavia and elsewhere that practice limited direct democracy. And of course, if any of you have ever voted here in the US, then you're probably very familiar with the propositions on the ballot. That is a limited form of direct democracy. That is voters voting directly on the law. But in general, it's always representative democracy. And so I'm just going to use representative democracy as democracy, just in general. Next, we have autocracy, as you can guess by the root auto. Of course, demo, right, means people, like demographics means information about a population. The auto in autocracy means by yourself, or by oneself, just like an automobile is a car. Its automobile is that it's mobile by itself, it moves itself. And so an autocracy is essentially ruling by yourself or ruling alone. And as we know, autocracies are usually dominated by autocrats who are singularly supreme rulers who usually are not held accountable by anyone. Of course, that there can be different factions vying for power and whatnot, but usually it's a single supreme leader. Next slide, please. Yes, I love this. All right, so here we have the countries around the world who claim to be democratic. They claim to be democratic. And we have here the only exceptions, right? Saudi Arabia, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Brunei, Afghanistan, and Vatican City. Yeah, that one sticks out a little bit, but the Holy See does not claim to be a democracy. The Pope rules the Vatican with an iron fist. I always found this map kind of humorous. Of course, I think it's had a new addition in recent years. Afghanistan wasn't on there a couple of years ago, sadly. Now it is. But yeah, the entire world claims to be democratic, and so this kind of harkens back to Francis Fukuyama and the end of history being liberal democracy. And this kind of serves as evidence that at least democracy has been identified as the best system to identify with for purposes of public affair and international PR. Next slide, please. But here we go. Here's a democracy index. This is from The Economist. There are lots of democracy indices out there. Some of them factor in different stuff. This one, I think, has 40 or 50 different factors that they use. Some of them are controversial, but we'll just go with this one. It's not perfect, none of them are, but here we're seeing that despite the claims to be democratic, this is a map of the countries which are really democratic. And to many of you, this may not look very surprising. You kind of have all of the usual suspects here. It can be fun to kind of find the ones that stick out. Autocrats in otherwise democratic regions, or Democrats in otherwise autocratic regions. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to give you a very brief explanation of presidentialism versus parliamentarism, because I think a lot of people don't know. Maybe some of you who are international students are very familiar with it. For example, I know we have, I think we have quite a few, I think we have a couple of Indian international students here. They understand parliamentarism very well because India is a parliamentary democracy. But essentially, in a presidential democracy, like in the United States, you have dual legitimacy. Right? You have the president who is elected by the people. He's legitimate. He has a popular mandate. And then you have the legislature, Congress, which is also elected by the people. They also have a popular mandate. They're both legitimate. One is not more legitimate than the other. And so they kind of duke it out, and you can have situations where you have divided government, right? Where the presidency is controlled by one party and Congress is controlled by another. And when you have divided government, I think we're all aware, usually the government doesn't really get much done due to major disagreements between the ruling parties. And usually it's very difficult for legislation to get through. And this is, largely true for other presidential democracies. But in a parliamentary democracy, it's totally different. I think a lot of Americans don't even know how parliamentary governments work. I think they all kind of figure that every democracy works like ours does, but they don't. In a parliamentary democracy, the government, the prime minister and his cabinet ministers, they are all derived from the legislature. All voters do in parliamentary democracies is they go and they vote for the legislature, the parliament, which is kind of analogous to our Congress. And then from there, whichever party or parties, plural, win control of the parliament, they're able to negotiate and they're able to vote in a government. In order for the prime minister and his cabinet to be replaced, it doesn't matter what the voters think. It has nothing to do with the voters. All that matters is that the members of parliament lose faith in the government. For example, and many of you probably know, the United Kingdom just got another new prime minister. The United Kingdom has not had elections since 2019. And yet this is the third prime minister who they've had. The voters had no say. The voters didn't go to the polls. They didn't elect Liz Truss. And it's all perfectly legitimate because that's the way their system works. And thus, in a parliamentary system, there is no possibility for divided government because the party in control is also the one which always controls the executive and always controls the government and cabinet. There can be internal divisions and coalitions can fall apart. It's not perfect, but essentially the government can never be divided. And the prime minister and the government is only accountable to the legislature. They're not really accountable to the people. Of course they are. It's a bit of a proxy layer, right? Through the parliament, they're accountable to the people. But all they need to worry about is keeping the parliament happy. And you could argue that the parliament might sometimes select for people who come from the richer end of the income spectrum. And so in some ways, it's not perfectly representative, but that is neither here nor there. Semi-presidential democracies also exist. These are countries which have a prime minister and a president. I'm not going to get into that here because it's a very long discussion. Sometimes the prime minister is more powerful. Sometimes the president is more powerful. But then we get into the distinctions of premier presidential and presidential parliamentary systems. The one that's in front tells you which one is more powerful. Very famous semi-presidential democracy is France. They have a president who's very powerful and a prime minister who is also powerful, but not as powerful as the president. But for now, we will just leave it at presidential and parliamentary democracies. Next slide, please. And this is my favorite map. Here you get to see the forms of government around the world. Now, for our purposes, blue, as you can see, are presidential democracies. Again, this doesn't tell you about the quality of the democracy. It just tells you about the form of government that they use. And then for our purposes, orange and red are essentially the same. The only distinction is that red are constitutional monarchies, but again, they're parliamentary democracies. The British parliament and the Indian parliament function in very similar ways. And India is not a constitutional monarchy. Of course, that can change from case to case, but for the most part, these constitutional monarchies are just as good as any other parliamentary republic. In yellow, you can see the semi-presidential systems. Again, not really going to get into that here. You can see it's a bit in Africa, Russia, very prominent example, although the quality of Russia's democracy is certainly questionable. And you also have France and Portugal. But to be honest, most of the time you're just going to be dealing with France. And if you want to learn more about France, I encourage you to study it. They have a very interesting history there with their political system. In purple, you have the absolute monarchies. And if you could recall the map we looked at previously with the countries that claim to be democratic, I think you'll notice a commonality here, that the absolute monarchies on this list also happen to be the countries who don't claim to be democratic. I believe almost all of them are concentrated in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Oman and the UAE, as we talked about. And then in brown, we have these single party states, unsurprisingly, China, North Korea, Vietnam, and a few others. And actually, I think Cuba is also brown, which means it is a single party state. Again, nothing you wouldn't expect. And so I believe that's all I have here. Telling you about a little short taster about comparative politics, about democracies, autocracies, and the different forms of democracies around the world. It gets even deeper than this. There are different types of electoral systems and all different ways of electing people, many of which are much better than the system that we use in the United States, particularly systems which are much more proportional, but that is beyond the scope of this little lecture today. So thank you very much, everyone, and I will now pass it on.